It's funny when you consider these unsung heroes and cars that kind of failed at what they were trying to do or just blended away into obscurity, how many of them actually come from brands with a long, rich history, sometimes in the racing world, sometimes in the road world, and then just occasionally it actually works out really well. With Spyker, for instance, they had a history way back in the early 1900s, but then they went away for quite some time, and then they came back guns blazing and still are building some fantastic cars. Some of my favourite cars, in fact, in terms of the attention to detail that they have in their production and design. More often than not, though, unfortunately, these returning names from the automotive world, be it in luxury, racing, supercars, whatever the case may be, they tend to fail. And that's even more of a shame, I think, when it comes from a returning brand, because if it's some brand new name like Pagani, for instance, or Koenigsegg, if they had failed instead of succeeding as spectacularly as both of those brands have, it wouldn't have mattered as much because we didn't know those brands already, so it would be just another maker who came and then disappeared again. Whereas if you bring back an older brand, for instance how TVR has come back and gone, or how Marcos came back and went, and various others too, it kind of hurts more. And there are a lot of purists who hate the idea of certain brands being brought back at all, and that's certainly the case here, because for those who are unfamiliar with the brand Hispano-Suiza, this is a very old company. Now, they were actually founded way back in 1904. They were already competing in racing by at least 1910, and they went defunct in the late 60s, around 1968. They changed hands a few times in terms of the people who were in control of them. They had their hand in multiple pies, including aviation, which is not too surprising for companies back then, including Spyker that I mentioned earlier. They did a similar thing, and of course BMW did as well as various others. But they made predominantly luxury cars. That's what many of their vintage and classics are known for being. This one, though, is of course a much more modern interpretation of the Hispano-Suiza name. And incidentally, the name itself, Hispano-Suiza, translates in English to Hispanic Swiss, which again gives you an insight into the kind of history, the birth of the company and production therein. Now, in the year 2000, at the turn of the century, a company called Maciel Engineering, who are based in Spain, produced a new concept car called the HS21, and they branded it under the Hispano-Suiza name. But it wasn't exactly a looker, and I'm kind of happy that that car failed, or at least wasn't produced, because if you Google the HS21 and find an image of it from the year 2000, it's a blue vehicle, it's just boring. It's an ugly, boring concept car that didn't really bring anything new to the table, and it looked kind of like what the Bugatti Chiron concept from the late 90s would have looked like if they'd have commissioned Mitsuoka in Japan to design it for them. It's not exactly a good-looking car. 2 years later, however, in 2002, that same company, Maciel Engineering, produced this, the HS21 GTS prototype, the evolution of that original HS21 idea, but in a similar way to a few other cars that really benefited from much more extreme treatment. You could even quote the MGX Power SVR as another perfect example coming from the Qualmangusta originally. This one really benefited from being upgraded to more of a race spec machine. Now, the intentions for this car were straight at Le Mans. That's where their sights were headed, the Le Mans 24-hour race. Now, it didn't actually compete, and I'm not certain whether or not it actually competed in any racing at all. I think it might have done some track time, but not exactly in as a successful way as many of the other supercars of the earlier 2000s, to say the very least. Visually, I'm kind of a fan of this car. I think it's an interesting looking design. It didn't necessarily need to be a Hispano-Suiza. There's nothing that necessarily necessitates that. It could have easily been a brand new name, or even just named under Maciel Engineering themselves. I mean, what would have been wrong with that? Just call it the Maciel HS21 GTS. But of course, name brand recognition goes a long way in the supercar world. The problem is, though, when you bring back a name, as I mentioned earlier, that was known predominantly for something completely different, and then try to turn it into like a supercar company instead, that's risky territory, because the people who don't know the name, well, it's going to make no difference to those people where it came from, And for people who do know the name, they're probably going to be purists who don't like the new direction of the company. So it's a very difficult area to tread when you're bringing back, or resurrecting, in other words, an old automotive marque. Now, in terms of what the car was capable of, at least on paper, it did have a lot of promise. It's a mid-engine rear-wheel drive car, no surprises there, 6-speed sequential, has an impressive engine for the early 2000s supercar scene, especially a 7-litre V8 with 600 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque. And although the performance figures aren't exactly known, you can make some pretty well-informed guesses of how quick it probably was. It looks relatively lightweight construction. The frame was steel, but you could probably assume that the body was more likely than not some kind of composite, perhaps aluminum, and the performance you could probably assume would be in the 200 mph region, depending on the downforce settings. 0 to 60, probably about 3.8 seconds, maybe a little bit less, especially with a sequential gearbox. So ultimately, although the car feels kind of pointless in terms of resurrecting the Hispano-Suiza name, it could have been a cool supercar just in general. And to me, the visual style of the car looks like some kind of mystic blend of a Celine S7, a Tommy Kaira ZZ2, and a little bit of Mosler MT900 as well. And if you can have a car that looks like those three things put together, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Plagiarism, on the other hand, isn't a good thing, but looking like three cars that are as good as those, that's a pretty good start. It's got a big capacity V8, which is a pretty strong choice for a supercar, clear track day implications, and who knows, this could have actually been a force to be reckoned with in the early 2000s Le Mans GT scene. It could have gone up against stuff potentially even like the Celine S7 or the Maserati MC12, even up until the mid-2000s, perhaps a little bit later as well. Now, unfortunately, it seems like it never had that chance, so this is one of those occasions in Unsung Heroes where it's not a car that tried to revolutionise the world, and we've talked about plenty of those that have. This is more just an occasion where, in a similar way to the Morgan Aero GTN, for instance, that it just deserves more attention. It's one of those supercars that's interesting to know about. Some of you doubtless already have heard of this one, but plenty of people haven't. And to me, as far as failed supercars go, or just concepts or prototypes, this is actually one of the slightly more interesting ones, because a lot of those garden shed style supercars tend to be built just by a guy who wanted to slap his name on something, and they just fit a generic engine and offer pretty much what everyone else already does. It's some kind of GT car with a front-engine rear-wheel drive layout that kind of apes Aston Martin in some way. This one doesn't do that. It had interesting implications, it set its sights on the racing world, it resurrected a very iconic name in the automotive world, and those things, I think, make it pretty impressive. Overall, it didn't get the chance to shine, which is a shame, and it probably never will, because if Hispano-Suiza were resurrected again now, well over a decade later, in fact almost 2 decades later, it would probably be something entirely different again. The ultimate fate of the HS21 seems to be a murky and understandably disappointing one for a couple of reasons, neither of which are particularly surprising. They did plan, apparently, to produce 6 vehicles and take it racing as well, but that didn't happen. It would appear, at least from some of the Google images, that the car was fitted with a livery and even used on track at some point. It would appear so, at least, and unless the image is photoshopped, even potentially used in some form of race or testing against other GT cars. It seems murky, though, as to what actually happened there, at least as far as what I could find. However, ultimately it was 2 things that killed the car. One, Maciel Engineering had other jobs and commitments that they had to do, and also, even more of a killing blow, was the FIA. The rules at the time dictated that the car would have had to have been significantly changed, basically from a ground-up level, to actually be allowed to compete. The car even underwent an engine change through its life. It was originally planned to have a 5-litre V10, ultimately ended up with a 7-litre V8, so it was getting too costly, too expensive, too complex, and for those pretty understandable reasons, it never really continued. So it's a shame that a car like this, which definitely had some potential to say the least, didn't get that chance. And if there's any vehicle that falls under the category of Unsung Heroes, that's the exact occasion where a car like this could be eligible, and I think it is. But overall, still a very cool supercar, I think, and one which I would say does deserve more attention. It's not the kind of car that you can generally do a ton of research about because it's so obscure, basically. But a cool one, I think, nonetheless. But that's it for this pick. Of course, you can click through at the end of this video to see all of the previous episodes. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.